Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are we came off our AGM and now we have an exciting post-AGM event. So first off, the SPA would like to acknowledge the amazing leadership and dedication of many members in our physiotherapy community in working through the challenges associated with the physiotherapy national exam. And this journey has started back many years ago in 2018. And there has been a lot of steps, and we'd like to acknowledge the Saskatchewan College of Physical Therapists, as well as working groups and committees that have really helped support the past year. I think that Saskatchewan is an envy of many of the provinces in that a lot of groundwork and hard and challenging effort has been put towards the development of the practice-based assessment. So today we are going to have a presentation by the SCPT Executive Director, Jason Vogelsang. And then following that, we have a number of panelists that will join us for a discussion. And then following that, we will have an interactive networking event in the Remo platform. So now I'm going to just give Jason a chance to come on the stage here. There we go. Sorry, multitasking. So Jason is the Executive Director of the Saskatchewan College of Physical Therapists, where he provides leadership in the licensing and regulation of the physiotherapy profession in Saskatchewan. Prior to joining SCPT, Jason was the Assistant Registrar with the Saskatchewan Professional Teachers Regulatory Board, supporting the regulatory and operational functions of the organization. So a warm welcome and special thanks for joining us today, Jason.
Good morning. So let's test my ability to share a screen. Present that. Let's see what we're doing there. And then go there.
And I'll just give a note, if you want to see Jason's screen in a larger view, there's 4 arrows in the top corner of that window, which will enlarge it. Thanks so much.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the association for the invitation. It's always good to get out and about, as it were, even if it is virtually, and present some of the good things that I stepped into when I took on the role of Executive Director and Registrar in October. By large, this is the largest one that I stepped into, and I'm very grateful for the work that had been done before my arrival in preparation for the practice-based assessment. What I'm going to do today is very quickly go through how we got to where we are and the responses or the timeline that happened nationally, and how the SCPT responded to that, ultimately leading to a very quick overview of the practice-based assessment. And then move into the panel discussion where all of the fun and exciting bits of conversation will occur. Okay. So the generic slide of who we are and what we do. Everyone here, I believe, is a member, so you should all be familiar with that. The SCPT is the mandate is to protect the public by ensuring competent, safe, and ethical practice by physical therapists in Saskatchewan, and we do that through licensing, continuing competency / professional development, and the complaint management process. So how did we get here in terms of the clinical assessment and the national exam, national PCE on the clinical side of things? I will go quickly through the timeline. In the next slide or two, you also see some bolded portions. The bolded portions are the SCPT Saskatchewan specific responses to that, and then we'll go into the practice-based assessment. So as we all know, in March of 2020, the pandemic was declared, and at that time there was a cancellation or a postponement of all national exams related to physical therapy. The written PCE was eventually continued with remote administration, and that continues to be done and seems to have worked quite well. The clinical PCE ultimately was canceled for all of 2020 and 2021. In March of 2021, there was an unsuccessful attempt and cancellation of a virtual clinical exam sitting. At that time, the SCPT began to see some writing on the wall. One moment. Cancel that phone. SCPT saw the writing on the wall a little bit, and we started to make moves to allow an alternative to the PCE clinical exam. To do that, bylaws had to be changed, and so that process began then. In the summer and the fall, as it looked like a bylaw change was going to be made, we started to explore alternatives to the PCE clinical for licensure. And so we started to explore partnering with other provinces and exploring a practice-based assessment. And ultimately, out of circumstance and a bit of vision, we landed on the practice-based assessment. In September of 2021, there was a second attempt at a full delivery of a virtual clinical exam. That got further than the first, as I understand, and some candidates were able to complete enough of the exam to be licensed, and that decision was left to the individual colleges and the licensing bodies. So in Saskatchewan, we were able to license 4 individuals into full practice based on that virtual exam. And then following that incomplete exam attempt, the national body, CAPER, indicated that there was an indefinite cancellation of the exam until a more robust option was available, or if in-person administration of the exams could occur again. In the fall of 2021, and following that announcement of the indefinite cancellation, the SCPT developed the practice-based assessment, and that was approved through our registration committee and through council. And we were able to launch that practice-based assessment, the first round of that, in December of 2021. And we are just now in the final stages of concluding the 4th round of the practice-based assessment. In January of 2022, CAPER announced the discontinuation of the clinical PCE and turned its efforts to the National Expert Panel that was initiated and will be developing a new replacement for the clinical PCE. What that looks like and how that's administered is yet to be determined, but they have started to lay a very good groundwork and foundation for that work. Now, here in Saskatchewan, as we all know, there was a process initiated before the pandemic to review the PCE clinical in relation to Saskatchewan's licensure. And that took the form of the PCE working group here in Saskatchewan. I just want to make it clear and very conscious that the PCE working group started before the pandemic, started before the issues around the clinical exam administration, virtually and things like that. And it's much longer, much more, vision is much more longer term in nature and separate from the shorter term work necessitated by the pandemic. So I guess what I'm trying to say is my understanding is that PCE working group, that work would have occurred and still worked through to the recommendations and next steps, regardless of what the pandemic brought. But we now live in a time where the pandemic influences everything, and clearly the pandemic had some interaction and intersection with the work of the working group. So pre-pandemic, in the fall of 2019, there was a request from SCPT membership to review the clinical PCE in relation to the Saskatchewan licensure requirements. And so Council created the PCE working group. And that working group worked throughout the pandemic. It was delayed, throughout the pandemic, as most things were, but they completed their work. And in September of 2021, the working group report was published with their recommendations. Shortly after that, SCPT Council committed to explore the report's recommendations, and that's kind of the stage where we're at now. So I threw in there the clinical PCE was discontinued. So in the spring of 2022, we've just finished a survey of membership regarding the report's recommendations to see where the membership's minds and opinions are on those recommendations. And so we've done that, and the report's recommendations will be tabled at Council's meeting at the end of May, at which time Council will consider possible next steps following that feedback. So in summary, to the SCPT responses to the clinical PCE, I've summarized them in both the short and medium term and then the longer term. So in the short term, we had to make some bylaw changes to allow an alternative to the PCE, because the PCE national exam was mentioned, I think, by name in bylaws. We explored alternatives. Like I said, we looked to see if we could partner with other jurisdictions in their work to see, for example, if BC and Alberta did an OSCE type exam, could we join forces and jointly offer that? But ultimately where we ended up was the practice-based assessment. And so we've gone through the process of development of that, implementing that. We are now in the stages of refining that process. We've gone through, you'll see in the next slide, 52 candidates through that process. There have been some lessons learned through that process, and we are beginning to review that and tweak that process to make sure that it remains a viable option for at least the next 2 to 3 years that we will need it until either there's a national replacement or the PCE working group's recommendations, one of them is adopted, and we change licensure that way. In the longer term, we have the PCE working group report. We're exploring and considering the report's recommendations. Around that, we're gathering feedback in Saskatchewan and nationally, because there is some interactions with other jurisdictions around our licensure because of labor mobility nationally. And at the same time, the SCPT, and I hope individual practitioners are participating in CAPER's national expert panels work, and we're anticipating their work to be quite thorough and robust at the end of that work. Hopefully that we can return to something that we had before pandemic, both a national alignment of assessments nationwide. So that moves us into the practice-based assessment. So I'm going to go very high level in terms of a quick overview of that. And if you have questions, we can deal with that in the expert or in the panel discussion. So the practice-based assessment has 5 components: the ACP, the chart audit, a candidate interview, a supervisor interview, and a CCP submission. You'll see from that, and those of you who are either a supervisor or an assessor, I know some of those are in the group today as well. The ACP, the chart audit, and the supervisor interview are done by the supervising PT with the restricted licensee. And then the restricted licensee does the candidate interview and submits their CCP submissions. So there is a balance there between the individual licensee and the supervisor. As I indicated, we have run 52 individuals have or are completing the PBA. I believe this last group has 7 individuals in it. So the last 7 in the group are going through that, with the vast majority being successful through the assessment. The feedback to date has been largely positive and constructive. We've begun that feedback process with the assessors on the evaluation committee who have done the work of the practice-based assessment. They've given some very good ideas for some tweaks to that. In addition to that, other provinces, as a number of people have said, other provinces are looking to Saskatchewan to see what we're doing, how it's working, and some are looking to adopt portions of that or a similar model. So other provinces have asked for details of the assessment possibility to utilize. The Yukon has asked to participate as our capacity permits, and so I can indicate that one person from the Yukon is currently going through the practice-based assessment because we did have capacity in this last group. So all of that is positive. Other provinces have, like I said, asked for, at least some information around the assessment, and 1 or 2 have asked for much more detail around that because they are looking, considering a similar model to adopt in their own province. So following all of that feedback, we are making considered adjustments to the assessment to allow for its longer term use. So when it was first developed, it was intended to clear what I call the COVID backlog of restricted licensees. We had around 50 of those that had been on didn't have access to a clinical assessment since the start of the pandemic. We've cleared most of those now. There are 1 or 2 still there, but we have to look forward to make sure to determine if the practice-based assessment as it was developed will be sufficient for new graduates and those graduates that may not have been in the practice setting for as long as the COVID cohort had been. So we are looking at whether or not the eligibility criteria is still adequate, whether the component weighting is adequate and sufficient. And then we're also very cognizant of and trying to attempt to mitigate any potential biases within the process. So you saw in the components that there is 3 of the 5 components right now are based on the assessor, the supervisor, input through the ACP, chart audits, or the interview. We recognize that there are some biases or potential biases within that process, in that, for example, if a candidate were to fail, that may mean additional supervision work for the supervisor, or there is an incentive for that supervisor to give good assessments to them to get them through that process. So we're trying to make sure that we're aware of those and that we're mitigating those as much as possible within the assessment, given the environment that we find ourselves in. So that is very much a high-level process overview of the assessment. I just wanted to end off on a note of gratitude for the success to date of the practice-based assessment, and hopefully the enduring success of the assessment. And that includes the great patience and expectations of the restricted licensees. I can say when I first started, I began to hear, some stories from other provinces where they were getting a lot of impatient messages from their restricted licensees throughout that process, understandably so to a certain extent. But I must say our restricted licensees in Saskatchewan have been phenomenal. They have been very patient and very understanding of the process and working through that process. And they've been very, very cooperative. So thank you to them. Also, a huge thank you to the supervisors of those restricted licensees. We understand that when you took those licensees on, you were not expecting to have to supervise them for upwards of 2 years. So thank you for stepping up to that. The SCPT Registration Committee and Council for being able to be so flexible and so dedicated to be able to develop a program, an assessment that appears to be working, is working, and to do it in such a quick fashion. That happened in months, whereas previous assessments have taken years to develop. And lastly, but not leastly, the members of the evaluation committee. We sent out a call for evaluators and assessors for this process, and we got an excellent group of assessors that are committed to the process and take their work very, very seriously. So with that, I will end here and turn it over to Garnett and the panel discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Jason, for that fantastic overview and sharing that journey with us and the details of the practice-based assessment. So now I'm very excited to introduce our panelists joining us today. We are very fortunate to have a number of people to engage in a discussion. So Jason will be joining, as I introduced earlier. We're also fortunate to have Bronwyn Lasair. Bronwyn graduated in 1999 from the University of Alberta. She worked in Alberta at the Royal Alexandra Hospital in Edmonton and St. Paul's, and since then she has worked at the St. Paul's Hospital in Saskatoon for the past 10 years. She has supervised restricted licensees in both Alberta and Saskatchewan and was the main supervisor for 2 candidates that went through the practice-based assessment. Bronwyn served on the Saskatchewan College of Physiotherapy Committee Working Group to review the clinical component of the physiotherapy competency examination in relation to Saskatchewan licensure. Also today we have Dale Pitura. Dale is the president of SCPT and has been a member of council since 2017. He's been treating physical therapists in Saskatchewan since '95 when he graduated from the University of Saskatchewan. He's held a number of different positions over the years, from working with the Riders to the University of Regina teams to positions in private practice, as well as consulting with WCB. He's currently with Lightmark. He also served on the SCPT working group to review the clinical component of the physiotherapy competency examination in relation to licensure. I'm also excited we have 2 successful PBA candidates with us. Dharmanshu Lightwala graduated from Rajiv Gandhi University in India with a Bachelor of Physical Therapy in 2014. He volunteered with the Ontario Physiotherapy Association to bring physiotherapy awareness through the We Are PT campaign in 2019. And he successfully completed the written component of CAPR in 2018 and the practice-based assessment just recently in 2022. He worked as a resident PT in Ontario for 5 months and 21 months in Saskatchewan. And currently he's with Lifemark Health in Meadow Lake as a registered physical therapist. And Seve Speranza has joined us. Seve received his education at the University of Pitura in Human Movement Sciences and then graduated from physiotherapy in South Africa. His schooling experience included work in orthopedics, cerebral palsy, neurology, spinal cord injuries, pulmonology, outpatients, and sports injuries. He graduated in 2016 and has been working as a physio in various hospital settings since in orthopedic, pediatric, NICU, PICU, ICU, and outpatient settings. After immigrating to Canada in 2018, he completed the appropriate examinations to work and requalify as a physiotherapist in Canada. He successfully completed the SCPT practice-based assessment in January of 2022, and currently he is working at CBI in Moose Jaw. So welcome our panelists. I really appreciate everybody taking the time. For those in the audience, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So please enter your questions. There's a Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen. If you need to expand that, there's a little chat icon. And please enter your questions. We want lots of questions. We want to make this really interactive. So enter your questions into the panel. If someone's asked a question and you really want to hear that answer to that too, feel free to upvote it so that we can make sure that we get all the popular questions answered. So I'm going to start off, and first off, Bronwyn, I have a question for you. Can you share with us your experience being a supervisor and supporting candidates through the practice-based assessment?
Yeah, so I think some of my comments today are about supervision in general, right? So, I was an examiner for the national exam for a lot of years. So I'm comparing this process to what it was like to examine those new grads and people that were on restricted license. I'm also kind of looking at my experience supervising students, especially in their final placement as they're approaching entry level. And then our restricted licensees, whether they were doing the national exam or this process, we still, when they came into our site, had to train them and do chart audits and do an ACP at 6 weeks. So this process is very similar. And so there's quite a few people that I've supervised through that. And then with this group, we had really specific requirements for what we had to submit to the college. And I think as a supervisor, there's always some tensions because you are both an educator and you're responsible to support the person and to skill them up, right? And make sure they can meet your expectations. And then you're also an evaluator where you have to step back and allow them the opportunity to put their best foot forward and see, do they in fact meet the bar? And I think that is a tension in this situation and in other supervision situations. Where's that line between where I'm supporting and educating you and where I'm stepping back and seeing really truly what you can do, and recognizing that that is your responsibility to step up to the plate now. So I think that is one thing that certainly I have felt and experienced in this process. I think it's my job to give the person the best opportunity to demonstrate their skills. And then I have to recognize that ultimately it's the college that's going to make this decision. So they are delegating the work of observation to me, and I then report back with what I have observed and seen, and ultimately they will decide if that's enough for this process. But it is still, I would say, this process, it's a bit more uncomfortable if you have someone who's close to the line, because it's not anonymous. On the exam, if you did poorly in my station, I would just mark you 0 and you would never know it was me and I'd never have to look you in the face again. In this process, if you are closer to that line, I have to give you direct feedback so you can skill up because I'm still your educator. But if my feedback to the college results in you not getting your license, I have to come into work tomorrow and so do you. So that is uncomfortable and it is stressful as a supervisor. I think I have felt with students or with staff members who are struggling, in all my different supervising experiences, when you have someone that's close to the mark, there is a lot of pressure to make sure that you're being fair, that you're not being too harsh, not being too lenient. And how do you exactly navigate that? Those are challenges that certainly are evident in this process for me.
Well, thank you very much, Bronwyn, and we will some very good food for thought that we're going to dive into a little deeper. But before we do that, I'd like to flip us over to the other side. So, Seve, can you share with us your experience and what it was like being a PBA licensee candidate?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity. Besides stressful, I think it went pretty okay. I knew it. So obviously we got the email from Jason and the college saying this is the format. It was nice to see that they stuck to the format. There was a list of 7 questions that they ultimately asked us. They gave us time to prepare for it. I'm not the person that plans ahead, so I like to answer things off the cuff. So it was nice. it was a good opportunity for the lady that did interview me. I'm speaking from the interview aspect. We could actually have a decent discussion. She could see how I reason things. And I think that's where the clinical component often misses the mark. You know, in my opinion, the clinical component is very robotic. Hi, my name is do, 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 do. With us, it's a little bit more, dare I say, informal. You can actually have a discussion, you can reason, you can justify. They can see where you're coming from. With myself being an internationally trained physio, I'm trained a little different. That's just it. And in my experience, just because it's different doesn't mean it's wrong. And it was nice to get that feedback and really go from that side. So are there definitely positives from the practice-based assessment? Yes. Like I said, you can reason, you can justify. I felt more comfortable. There wasn't this lump in my throat, you know, and ultimately some people just don't test well. It's the reality of it. Now, obviously it could be modifications, and I was guinea pig number one, or in group or number one. So pros and cons to that too. The nice thing of going first, you can get it over and done with. Going first, negative, is obviously you don't know what to expect. So all in all, a good experience. I was fortunate enough to pass, or deemed sufficient. And just to touch on with what Bronwyn was saying about meeting the bar, I think we all need to realize, both candidates and testers, ultimately it's still entry-level grades. We're not testing master's level physios. So it was nice to really get that message out there as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much, Seve. So now I would like to come to you, Dale. One of the comments that Seve made was entry level, and in a prior discussion with Bronwyn, we talked about entry level and how that can be challenging as a supervisor. Where is entry level? And then as the licensee candidates coming in. Dale, having been practiced in Saskatchewan for many years and worked with many different therapists at different competency levels, I'm interested in your thoughts around entry level and advice for our profession on making that assessment.
Sure, I can give my 2 bits worth there. I think that you know, that it is always a difficult kind of struggle, I guess, when you're dealing with a student or dealing with a restricted license. I have done some students or worked with students in the past. Overall, as you work with them longer, you just kind of get a, you know, you do use your gut to a certain extent of how these people are doing and how they're coming along. Obviously, that's not where our profession is in the world, is just go with your gut and go for it. We obviously want evidence, and we want evidence practiced based services, etc. And we do have some of those out there now. The continuing competencies that have been put together nationally or certainly give us a guideline to where an entry level competency is. The ACP, I believe that's the document that we use, is another one that gives some guidelines for that. When I'm thinking just basically from a therapist, you can enter into if you're a restricted licensee and you're using or with a supervisor that has a specified practice that only, you know, maybe is more specialized in a certain group. Do you get as wide a variety to be able to understand more of a basic entry level practice, right, across a broader spectrum? But also on the flip side of that, does that matter? I mean, when you're entering into practice, entry level, when you get your license, entry level is who walks through your door per se, right? And you may happen to be in a certain practice that only has a certain clientele, but for the most part, you're going to get who walks through that door. So you have to be comfortable in what you're dealing with. And I think Seve's comment in regards to what's your reasoning, right? We all have skills. We all develop skills. We develop those skills through our schooling, through our training. But when you're entry level, what is your reasoning? What is your thought process? How did you get to the end game of what's your treatment plan for that particular person? And that's going to be a little bit different, but if it's logical and it seems appropriate, then I think you're at the entry level. So we do have, like I mentioned, we've got some sources out there now that help us to define that, but it still comes down to working with that person and seeing what they're how they deal with the different situations.
Thanks, Del. Very helpful. Any other panelists with comments on entry level?
Yeah,
All
I
right.
find entry level hard to define in my situation because if you look at the ACP and the definition, it usually is based on the percentage of supervision that somebody needs. And it assumes that a huge chunk of your caseload is simple. And it makes this distinction between simple and complex patients. And in my work setting, we don't have a single simple patient in the whole building. It's all complex plus. And depending on the time frames, often you don't see the same thing twice. So it is in fact difficult to evaluate entry level when none of these patients would ever be on a national exam. They're way too complex. So I think that as a supervisor, then you use your gut actually based on what have other people with similar amounts of exposure to this setting been able to do? Where have they been at by this point in evaluation? And certainly the ACP gives descriptions of behaviors and skills that are helpful. But I think one of the things, if you look at other settings, like with students, if you have someone that's close to that line, there is self-doubt as a clinician. So I find it helpful to go to other clinicians and have a sounding board. This is how this student is performing. What do you think? Is that acceptable or not? And I wonder if the college will actually look at having a consultant or someone that supervisors, especially if they don't have peers in the same setting, that could have a second look, someone that they could reach out to. With the school, we reach out to Peggy and we describe the situation and we get input, and that helps us to make our decisions when people are close to the line. So I think that might be something to consider in the future for this process.
Great suggestion. Thanks, Bronwyn. So now, Dharmanshu, I'd love to come to you now and hear about your experience as going through the practice-based assessment as a licensee candidate.
Thanks, Gurmit. Yep. So I moved to Saskatchewan from Ontario on 2020 January 1st, and within 2 months it was pandemic. So I think I did the right decision because Meadow Lake is a pretty small community, 5,000 people, and we didn't have pandemic here. It was pretty quiet. At the same time, I did my tuitions for clinical component in Ontario with the method Seve mentioned, the robotic. Hi, my name is Dharmanshu. I'm a physiotherapy assistant, and I was very much. It was tough for me to finish the required test, myotome, dermatome, upper quadrant, lower quadrant scanning in 10 minutes. So I always used to wonder how is that possible? I couldn't give the exam. I moved to Saskatchewan, and exam never happened for 2 years. When I got email from Jason and other people from SCPT about this exam format, about this PB assessment, uh, it was interesting. I was very happy that it was very much focused on practice based. So if I'm working in a private setup at LifeMark right here, and the patients I see, I see a lot of patients of vestibular rehabilitation. I know that's not entry level, but I do see a lot of vestibular patients, and I was very happy when my interviewer when she asked me about those cases. When I went ahead, I discussed my favorite topics, and then she asked depth. In depth, she asked me about those, and I like the whole process. It was pretty much focused on what I'm doing right now and what I'm interested into. So that was something I compared with what I learned in Ontario. So yeah, I loved it.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, now coming to, we have some great questions from our audience here. So this is a question for supervisors. How do you manage in more remote locations to provide supervision? We have a number of communities in Saskatchewan that have a very high need for physical therapy resources, and they're wanting to hire new grads. And any comments on this challenge for providing supervision in potentially rural and remote locations?
So I'll just go ahead quick.
Go ahead, yes.
As I told you, I live in Meadow Lake. It's a very small knit community, and my supervisor, he comes once in 2 weeks from Cold Lake, Alberta. So he's appointed by Lifemark, and I think that's the great opportunity I have. In Ontario where I used to work before. My supervisor used to live 3 hours away, and he used to consult. He used to help me over the video conference, over the phone, and that's how he managed in Ontario. So I never had any supervisor on site, let it be Ontario or Saskatchewan.
Thank you. And did you find having that video connection or having the intermittent availability, did you feel that you had the support that you needed?
Absolutely. It was, I used to, of course, if you have it on site, at the end of the day, you can go and ask, you can check with them compared to on video, you can contact them once in a while. But I think I never had an issue where I didn't get my answer or concerns answered for sure.
I think Garnett, if one thing that the and obviously I haven't supervised remote restricted licensees before, but just thinking more in general, I think if one thing that the pandemic has shown us is that, remote interaction is improving, increasing, and can be a good tool in this situation. I know that I don't know firsthand, but just I believe there's been clinics within the province that have actually been doing that type of mentoring and stuff for quite a long time, remotely, and just interacting and telehealthing in, if I use that word, even with um, uh, newer grads, newer licensees, restricted licensees from different areas. So using that technology is something that would be very helpful. Um, of course, there's tons of different technology out there, and I know that at the college we had a little bit of discussion about that, and had shied away from recommending specific different tools to use, trying to give it more of a guidelines of these are the things that have to be accomplished within those tools, privacy and all that type of thing. So I wouldn't be the person to ask for the exact tools, but I think there are lots of tools out there that would be helpful in being able to supervise more remotely, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Actually, very great point. Thank you, Dale. And actually, last year, actually it was 2020, we had SPA hosted a webinar, and we had Greg Sutton from Tiny Eye Therapies join. And he has thousands of therapists, speech language therapists all over the world. And he mentioned that he had a very formal remote supervision program where therapists could, for new employees that had joined his system, he had a system where he could provide feedback to them, and there was actually even a remote monitoring where they could view, and they were supervising or remotely viewing about 10% of the sessions, I believe he said, through that system. So the suggestion of technology might be a really positive one. All right. Any other questions on the remote supervision?
I just wanted to comment. I think that certainly having someone available to chat to over the phone or to bounce ideas off of is helpful, but I'm glad you bring up the ability to actually observe a session, because I think especially with newer clinicians, that having a senior therapist or a veteran therapist observe a session is critical, because a new learner often doesn't know what they have missed. And so their self-report of the session and how it went, their documentation of the session and how it went, may not accurately reflect what actually went on there or what they missed. And so I think that we have to, within the context of direct supervision, and especially within the context of this evaluation, we need to be really clear, I think, on the need for the evaluator, the supervisor, to observe the clinician and what they are actually doing. And I think that that is, I really like this process compared to the national exam, to be sure. But one of the things that we risk losing when we move to this, different supervisors, is we lose some of the standardization. And so if one clinician is never observed because the supervisor says, well, the charting looks good, and when they tell me about the cases, it seems reasonable, so I'm going to sign off on that ACP. And then you come to my site and I say, no, I'm going to observe you in different settings and different scenarios because I don't think I complete an ACP without observing you. That's not apples to apples. And we lose some of that standardization. And since the college is in fact delegating the role of assessing to the supervisors, you have to provide the supervisors with a minimum standard. And I think that will be one of the things that needs to be clearly defined, is that minimum observation standard, and how do we do that in different settings.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Some very good food for thought and considerations going forward. So another question from our audience here. Jason mentioned that the short and medium term plan for this assessment is roughly the next 2 to 3 years. Is there a current plan in place for licensing the class of 2022 and the class of 2023?
There is. It's the practice-based assessment. With the discontinuation of the clinical assessment, all of the jurisdictions had to put in place, find not only the short term for the COVID backlog of licensees, but then try to figure out how they will continue to license in the next 2 to 3 years until there's a replacement. And in Saskatchewan, that could be the national replacement, or it could be an alternative that comes from the PCE working group, depending on how all of that goes. So for the plan now, for at least the next 1 to 2 years, until we know better around the PCE working group, it will be the practice-based assessment. And the way I described it the other day to someone asking was, the bones of the assessment will remain the same. So you're still going to have those 5 components. What may change is how those components are weighted, as we've gone through the large group we've just gone through, and then, as I indicated, that large group is slightly different because they had been in the practice setting for 1 year to 2 years, some slightly more than those 2 years, whereas the new classes, that time frame will be a little bit shorter. It will be under 1 year likely, and that they'll be in the practice setting. So we just want to adjust those weightings to make sure that they're accurate and reflective. Take into some of those considerations that Bronwyn has highlighted in terms of, if you change supervisors, if you change geography of your practice, what does that observation need to look like? So, like I said, the bones will stay the same. Some of the weighting may change. The passing scores may adjust, or things like that. And other changes would be behind the scenes administratively to make it easier, a little bit more efficient to go through. But the short answer there is, for the next probably 1 to 2 years, for sure, it will be the practice-based assessment.
Thank you, Jason. All right, another question from our audience, from Jared here. How does SCPT support supervisors who are working with restricted licensees who are struggling?
I'll take a first stab at that one. As we've all discovered in the last 2 years, this process, this pandemic, has changed what that supervisory role is. It went from, you're supervising for 2, 3, 4 months until they have access to the national clinical exam, and you either pass it and you're fully licensed, or you go back to your restricted licensee. So regardless of how you cut it, the supervisory period is going to be longer. And as Bronwyn says, there is a new dynamic there. You're now, as a supervisor, both an educator and an observer and assessor evaluator, feeding that information to the college. So it has certainly shone a light on what that supervisory capacity is, and some of the challenges that were always there, perhaps, but are certainly more evident now that they're longer, particularly with those that are struggling. So the college is at the beginning of stages of looking at some supports that we can put in for supervisors. I think Bronwyn's idea of kind of a consultant / practice advisor for supervisors, for those borderline candidates, to have those difficult conversations is a really good one. As are some other things in terms of being much more communicative in terms of here's what we expect during supervision in general, and do we need some check-ins, have a process for perhaps supervisors that can raise their hand and say, my candidate is struggling, can I have some supports, and can we work with the college to say, how do we improve that candidate? So the short answer is we don't have anything quite yet, but it is certainly on our radar in terms of that need, and we will be working with that in the next coming periods.
Thank you, Jason. And related to that, and I open this up to the panel, what are some considerations for clinics and departments in being able to support clinicians that will be supporting the PDA process?
I think there needs to be a commitment of time. And I think that is going to be, in some practice settings, a challenge. So here, when we take on board a restricted licensee and we know we're going to have to do that, we're dedicating time to observe, to teach, to do the work of chart audits and whatever. So there's going to have to be a commitment to that. I think that it's our responsibility to do that work. That's the privilege of being self-regulated. We have to make that time, but in different settings, I think that could be a challenge.
Great, thank
I
you.
think, sorry to jump in there, but I think also, as you mentioned earlier, Bronwyn, now that if I say the stakes, quote unquote, are a little different when you're going through a restricted licensee process and you're a supervisor in that process. Having your colleagues within your clinic or your department understanding the process, so that if you do need to go to them and say, hey, can you help me out here? Can you give me some feedback? What do you think of this or that? Maybe even moving the licensee amongst to get a little better, so that you have a better feel, or you're more confident that, okay, I'm doing the right thing here. So I think those I know that in the private clinics that I've been involved with and have had students come through, there, that particular therapist doesn't always, they sometimes get not segregated off, but they're kind of on their own dealing with this person. So I think making the clinic more aware that this has got to be a group effort will help to calm some of that, and to make that decision more confident, for sure.
I do wonder too if the college is going to look at putting in some guidelines for who can be a supervisor. As I said, I think that the ACP definitions don't entirely help determining entry level when you don't have an entry level caseload. And I do wonder if there will be some guidance in terms of the experience or amount of support that a supervisor will need to bring to that.
That's one of the things that I was talking about in terms of that's on the radar of even outside of the practice-based assessment, the supervision of restricted licensees before the pandemic was largely left to the supervisors. So the registration committee and others in the college are aware of things that we can improve that process for, and one of them might be some guidelines in terms of, are you thinking of being a supervisor? Have you thought of A, B, and C, just to be confirming that you might have the capacity to do that. And to build on Dale's comments, was my answer to the original question of how can clinics work with that. It is basically that support of colleagues, and clinics that have multi practitioners are better situated to do that in a lot of ways. But that open and honest, frank conversations with the restricted licensees, those are easier done, I would think, earlier in the process to build that. Again, we've changed the timeline. You had 3 or 4 months with a restricted licensee, so you can have those conversations throughout, but now you're going to have longer ones. So if you can address an issue earlier, that should help. But that support of one another, and as Dale said, if you have colleagues that can observe as well, that gives more eyes on the candidate, more perspective, that I think is helpful to everyone.
Great, thank you.
And can I also just add? Sorry, can I also just add? Now with the college implementing the CCP, that can be a good way to try and attract people to want to become supervisors, because I think it's 2 or 3 of those core components can be applied as a supervisor. Communication, collaboration. I think there's another one. I just can't think. So if I'm looking to eventually become a supervisor, that's a pretty nice little follow.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, that's great point, Seve, with the new continued competency program. All right, now I'd like to just change gears here. We have some comments from students, our potential graduates or potential licensees that will be coming into potentially working with the PBA coming forward. So for the class of 2021, and noting that these licensees have been practicing since January of this year, is there a timeline for when they can go through the PBA?
Yeah, and I'll answer the other question around terms of the number of practice hours at the same time. I'll try to answer 2 or 3 of these questions. So part of the revisions that we're considering and that are going to council at the last part of May is the eligibility criteria. And so we're going to be removing that must be registered as of September of 2021. So that will allow admission to the assessment for new graduates and future graduates. For the time being, the 1,200 practice hours will be remaining, subject to council approval. And so that would put the next round of practice-based assessment to be administered in the fall. The 1,200 hours, I don't always know when the restricted licensees are going to hit that mark or when it's going to hit that mark. Some may be there now, and some will take a little longer. The logistics of that is the assessment is designed best to run with 15 restricted licensees at a time to ensure that we're using everyone's time resources effectively. So the best guess at this point, and we are planning for an assessment cohort to go through in the fall. And now whether that's September or November is still yet to be determined, and I'll be contacting restricted licensees later in the summer to see where those 1,200 hours might be for each of them.
Great, thanks for answering all those questions, Jason, very helpful. And we are getting close to the end of our time together. It has gone super fast, but I want to put the question out to Seve. Can you share with us what is your advice for people coming into, for people that will be seeking licensure through the practice-based assessment? And having successfully completed it yourself, what's your best advice for them?
Don't give up. For you, go for it. 3 years even. That's clearly enough. Another degree. If physio is not a passion, elsewhere. So hold the course. Also, another thing practice out of fear. Okay? I think there's a lot of fear out there with, yes, you are still a restricted licensee. Your supervisor is there to help you. Don't be afraid to ask. The fear that we as restricted license physios feel is, is that the end of my physio career before it's even properly started? Yes, the basis of evidence does help mitigate in those lines. But you have clinical reasoning for a reason. And we talk about evidence-based practice, we talk about the gut. Trust your gut sometimes, but curb it in line with evidence. That's about it.
Super. All right. Well, I want to extend a huge thank you to all of the panelists. Excellent job today, and Jason for the great presentation at the start. Self-regulation is a significant responsibility for our profession, and I commend all of the people that have been involved in designing the PBA, the research and support in creating the foundation for it to be set up, and all of the candidates, that the licensees that were very patient while the process was put in place and engaged in it, and all of the supervising therapists that have supported the process. I think it is a huge value add, and our Saskatchewan physiotherapy community has really stepped up and really taken on the challenges that have been presented with the pandemic and various other sources of challenges, and I really thank the community for really coming together on this. So congratulations. So now the SPA would really like to provide the opportunity for our community to be able to network and engage and connect. Shortly we are going to move from our presentation mode back to our networking mode. So please feel free to take your time and connect with our new physiotherapists that have joined our community, connect with colleagues, and we haven't had a face-to-face event in years now. And so it would be fantastic if we could have that engagement and have everyone connect. So thanks again, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
So just hold your seats and we will move into our floor mode. Thanks everyone.